Hey, welcome back. So on this week's episode, Jeremiah, Randy, and I are talking about parenthood. And is parenthood becoming too expensive? Does anybody feel that? I think some of our listeners feel that.
Well, again, I think for most of our listeners, they're probably past child rearing age.
Who knows?
But the two of you are right in the middle of it. So with 4 children in your household, but we talked to a lot of people about that's an unusual event with having that many children. In fact, the stats show that the number of women that are having children is actually going to be, the demographic impact is going to be a less population going forward, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I think everyone can relate to this topic a little bit of how expensive is it to raise kids. You either have your own kids you're raising or you're watching your kids raise your grandkids, right? Yeah. Being able to have some visibility of, and man, there's so many dynamics that have taken place here. And kind of the article we read was a Barron's article. It was saying back in the 60s, the birth rate was like 3.5 times for every woman. Every woman was having like 3.5 kids. So it's a growing population. And through the 60s, that fell deeply into the 70s. And throughout the 80s, it was right around kind of 2%, or 2 times. Like each woman was having 2 children on average, which means population replacement. That's right. Whereas now, in the current age, 2020s, that birth rate is 1.6. So every woman is having 1.6 kids, meaning we're having a falling population from birth rates naturally. There's also, immigration and other things that impact that. But just as the natural birth rate of a community, ours is falling. And part of this is what we're talking about is it's expensive to have kids. And we're going to kind of talk through kind of the social issues of what brought us here and the economics that we're looking at.
Well, and I think what's interesting today, let's bring this current as we move ahead to this presidential election season. You have both candidates that are talking about tax cuts or credits that are supposed to benefit families, because I think both candidates are acknowledging this decline in the population. It is becoming extremely expensive to raise kids in the U.S.
It is a long-term economic issue that both candidates, both parties are looking at, say, we have to resolve this. And we have to have more. We have to have more children. We have to have more babies in order to resolve that, right?
Because there are countries, I just looked up a couple of stats around the world, like Korea, for example, right? They're only producing about 1 to 1. And so they're actually seeing a decline in their population over the last several years. So, we have some other countries that we can look at and say, okay, this is an issue. Let's see if we can start to resolve it going forward.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll jump into the costs that we have today. And, from COVID to now even, I think it's highlighted the larger changes that have been happening, just the economics of, things have been shifting, and people have talked about the cost of childcare for a while. But with COVID, here's some of the stats I thought was really fascinating. There's a woman who runs a large childcare center, and she, daycare type stuff, has 450 kids. And the comment she was saying,
and she's got a waiting list, right?
She's got a large waiting list.
East Coast, I think, yeah.
East Coast, yeah. And she made a comment saying that her payroll costs, so paying her workers, have gone up 55% from 2019 to now. And her food costs, just feeding the kids as they're there, snacks and things, have gone up 40%. And so you take those two numbers and you think about the parents who are now, having to raise prices to pay for these workers and the food. The parents are also facing housing costs, continue to go up. And then, hopefully down the road, but the idea of paying for college has gone up 170%, since the 1980s. It really is a phenomenal bill. Forget the social items. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but just the bill to say, I need to put my children in care so I can go to work so we can have a household. And it's becoming increasingly expensive to do so.
Yeah.
So I did a quick calculation. If you have a child right now and your child goes to a public school, the cost of raising that child is somewhere close to $18,000 a year. Just gross. So for people that have multiple children in their household, I estimated if somebody had 4 children, they would probably no less than $100,000 a year just for basic. Now, if you're doing something extraordinary like putting your child to a private school, then there's that added cost on top of it. And so for husband and wife to make a choice, say we're going to have more children, the decision is economic. And there's the article that we read is about a couple. They both had master's degree. They both had good education. They both had good degrees, good jobs, I should say. And they never thought that having a child would be that economically significant to them. And yet when they had a child, it was like, whoa, this is really expensive.
Right. Right. They thought we both had professional careers.
Right.
They didn't have to sit down and crunch numbers. They thought certainly we make ample, to be able to raise a family. But I think that the cost of housing, the other article that I looked up, it was actually a podcast, a Freakonomics podcast, but they had correlated the pain of car seats and the obstacle of adding additional car seats to your car.
Wow.
And really what it ended up dovetailing into was the need for a larger vehicle. So this article, or the podcast from Freakonomics, was focusing on those families who are right at that decision point where they say, okay, we've had 2 kids. Do we want a third? And oftentimes the factor that comes into play is like, we're going to have to get a bigger car. We're going to have to deal with more of those car seats. Like, such a pain. And, I think Jeremiah brought up earlier, maybe before we even started recording, the percentage of dual income households in the U.S. has gone up over the last 40 or 50 years. So you've got 2 parents working hard to make ends meet, working hard to pay childcare expense for however many children they have.
Right.
And then to add one more thing on top of that, like, well, now we need a bigger house. Now it's not just that we don't have a home. Now we need something bigger. Now we need, I was shocked the other day. We have a friend of ours who drove by in a Tesla. Now, we don't drive a Tesla, fancy pants car, but she fit her 4 children in the back of this Tesla. And I had to laugh at her. I said, where are the backpacks? Like, where is there room for the water bottles? Right? So your life expands, both car and housing as well.
Yeah. Well, I think you brought up a really good comment about the dual income. And I think that's, I haven't seen the correlation, but, going back to the 60s with the higher birth rates, it said 3.5 children for every woman, how that has changed, partly just, I think, women entering the workforce. If both spouses are working, that's going to change, I think, the dynamic of how many kids they want to have. Mm-hmm. And then I think we talked before a little bit of, then you have single income, single parent households, and man, the amount of stress and difficulty that puts on them as well, one to provide financially as well as all these other things. So I think we're into a generation where it's odd for someone to be able to have unpaid family care. For us, I think for a number of people, there's grandparents, there's multi-generational dynamics that grandkids are playing with grandparents or being watched by them a day or 2 a week. And there's some real beauty there. There's also, I'm sure there's a number of households, but that's really a struggle to say, I'm raising my grandkids because my kids are doing their best to scrape by and to make a living. It can be a different dynamic for folks.
Again, the household dynamic, again, everybody makes a choice, but I think it's kind of interesting when COVID hit, a lot of the sociologists said, okay, we're going to have a COVID bump. And I went, okay, what does that mean? That means that individuals, that couples would be spending more time at home and getting paid to stay home. So they fully expected that there would be all of a sudden a bump in the birth rate.
Yeah.
9 months later, a year later, we'd have more children. And in fact, it didn't happen. And I think people had already made that decision prior to COVID, said, no, we're not going to have children. And they have the means to prevent it, right? So that just added to that conclusion, Jeremiah, what you talked about, going through the 60s. Laura mentioned, we had birth control in the 60s. Well, there's even more sophisticated ways for birth control, I guess. But more importantly, the decision was it was a lifestyle choice.
Yeah.
They didn't. Yeah. Right.
Right. Birth control is more accessible, certainly, than it was in the 60s. It's,
right.
There was kind of a turn in the culture around that time, right? It's more accessible. It's available. It's cost effective. But not just that. Like you said, it's becoming a lifestyle choice. I think it's interesting if we pair this conversation with the longevity revolution, which is something that we've talked about, especially when we're discussing this with our clients who are looking at retirement, that people
right.
are spending 30 years in retirement. Well, you've got the baby boomer population who's expected to live longer and put some added pressure on our Social Security and healthcare benefits, et cetera. You've got our generation who's working to pay into Social Security to provide for our baby boomers. Now, our baby boomers, though, are being asked to provide childcare so that our generation can go to work, right? So at a certain point, I wonder how the circle, it will come full circle.
Right.
You've got the baby boomer population providing free or low-cost childcare services to the millennial generation. And then at a certain point, the millennial generation will start to retire and need to care for their elderly baby boomer parents, potentially, right?
This is a whole nother, we don't have time to dig into this, but that's where my research on humanoids in the next 20 to 30 years is going to be very prevalent.
Oh, robots.
Because we don't have the people to take care of the people.
Yeah.
Much less family members to take care of. And people don't stay home. They disappear. They go to other parts of the country or the world to do their work. Well, that obviously doesn't create a cohesiveness. Grandparents can't watch children if your child lives in Florida, or whatever. So all those things. But I mean, again, the cost is still the prohibitive number here.
Yeah. The cost is, I think it's interesting when we talk about humanoids, because there is this focus on how to make our lives more efficient on a constant basis, right. How to make our lives more productive so that ultimately we can earn more and potentially have better work-life balance, enjoy our life better. At what point can we not replace the human factor?
And again, that's the test. I think it's going to happen over time. I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
I know they're doing a lot of experimentation in Japan right now. They're doing a lot of experimentation with older age communities. But again, our discussion right now is, this is the problem that we have right now, is that if you're going to have a child right now, as a financial planner, we come alongside of our clients, and that's where we have the family part of it. If we have the ability to bring the family into it, it is a cost factor of about $18,000 a year. And can the grandparents, if they have economic ability, can they support it? And not so much as that you owe it to me, or it's something, but it's understanding the family dynamics of this. And what our conversation with clients is that if the assets that you've accumulated ultimately is going to go to your children and grandchildren, why not start using some of that now to ease out the burden and the cost of having a child, additional children?
I think that's a great comment, Randy. We've had a number of clients. We've sat down and spoke about that with them. And it's a brave new world. This is a different dynamic than the prior, like the greatest generation and those of how they transferred things and wealth to the next generation. There's a massive amount of wealth that baby boomers have that will transition from baby boomer generation to, Gen X, millennials, kind of that next generation. But it's not here yet. And you talk about the longevity. It may still be 10, 20, 30 years away, depending on, the age of the baby boomers. But then you see these millennial and Gen X generation struggling, to create a family, to get by, struggling with the cost of housing. And to your comment, Randy, we've had conversations with a lot of folks who are the baby boomer generation thinking, how can I help my kids raise their grandkids? But at the same time, I don't want to just give them a bunch of money. That doesn't feel right. I think I might need some of the money, but I don't need all of it. And it's new. And I think, even coming up with some creative solutions for how grandparent generations can help support their kids, not because their kids aren't working hard, not because their kids are lazy, but to say their kids live in a different era and they're going to get all this money anyways. How do I do it a way different?
Tax advantageous to transfer some of that wealth earlier. Right now, the best time to transfer wealth is at the time of death, right? You get the most tax benefit if you wait, and it might be increasing that gift tax allowance, on an annual basis so that we could transfer wealth earlier. But you couple this with the increased cost of healthcare and health delivery. So if you're someone in the baby boomer population, you're not ready to transfer all of your wealth because you don't know what you're going to have to pay for long-term care expenses. And meanwhile, as a part of this article, which I thought was so interesting, they made a comment on the parents, those of us who are working dual income homes, right? The parents' mental health and high levels of stress.
That just came out recently in the last couple of weeks. Apparently, there's been a major study in talking about parenting and just how alone they feel. And just it's a loneliness, but it's a depression that they're going through raising these children, right?
Right. It's hard, right? Not for the faint of heart. So there's the economic impact that we're talking about, but it has a direct relationship to the emotional impact as well. Creating family is a wonderful thing. Creating a legacy is a wonderful thing. And kind of this economic machine that we all participate in, and the rising cost of healthcare, housing, et cetera, is childcare expense. All of that is creating this emotional response as well, this added stress. We see it in our kids too,
Well, you have less time with your children, so your children are more time in front of screen time, or more time in a nanny or day school. they're having less time with mom and dad. Mm-hmm. And if the kids are fortunate enough to have a mother and a father and have a family like that, that's great. But so oftentimes children don't have that. They have a single parent, or in some cases we know that our clients as grandparents are taking care of children, helping to raise children. It just creates all kinds of issues out there.
So this is making me feel sad. Say something positive.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say on the other side, the other side of this is really, I guess, in celebration of family. And I think to your comment, Laura, there's been a number of people who have self-selected to not create a family. They say, I look back at my family. I look back at my childhood. I don't want that. I see my friends. I don't want that. But I do think there's a beauty to family that is really hard. Family is better than anything else. It's also harder than anything else. And, even getting away from the economics of it, of taking what you've learned, what you've developed, what you've and imparting that to your children, having your children, share their joys and their adventures. I mean, I've gone to like an amusement park with a kid. If I were to go there by myself, I'd be like, well, these rides aren't that great. But you go with a kid and you just see their eyes light up, the wonder of the world, the excitement about what we're doing. We were in the woods this last Labor Day recently, and most of my kids, they comment of like, wow, look at that tree, look at this cloud, like just the wonder of the world. And to get to see that and to live into that, as a grown-up pulls me out of the drudgery of work. It gets into this concept of life is beautiful and to be enjoyed and to be shared. And I think there's times where a generation can lose that by one, either just not experiencing it themselves. They didn't have a great family in that way, or it's just so busy, it's so different that they never get there. But I do think that's the leaning into that as a young generation to say, growing people and raising people and connecting with a spouse, it's hard, but man, is it good. And to say that good is so great that it in fact outweighs all these costs and things. So I think there's a beauty of struggling through to say this is a season of life for a lot of people that's very tough, especially with housing, like you brought up early, Laura. Housing is making this very difficult to afford rent, the idea of buying your own home. Like for a lot of people, that feels off the table. And so we're seeing that in statistics that some people are opting out, but a lot of people are still opting in, right? People are jumping in and saying, I'm going to create something beautiful, even though it's hard.
Again, I think a lot of the solutions would be a change of how the economics are structured from the central government and state governments. A lot of the issues that we have are taxation. Going back to your comment earlier, Laura, I mean, taxation prevents people from selling certain assets and giving them to the other generation because the cost is going to be too expensive. So it'd be interesting if, the candidates we're talking about right now, if the candidates that comes up with a policy and procedures that allows parents to be more helpful to their children and grandchildren without being sabotaged with this huge tax bill by doing that. Yeah. And it would be so much more beneficial, like in housing, education, all those factors that come into play.
I think that ultimately we're going to, as a community of Americans, come up with some creative solutions here. Yep. Affordable housing. I think about the earlier career that I had as we were growing our family and the flexibility that I had to work from home, the flexibility that Jeremiah's employer gave him so that he could be home when I was traveling for work or have more flexible hours. We were just talking about parental leave. And, there's many countries that have a lot more generous parental leave laws in place to give ample time for attachment, between you. So, I think there are creative solutions to be had. And I think that drive, the reason to continue having family will continue to be there.
Right.
I think hearing a baby giggle is the best way to decrease stress. It's one of the top 10. And, I don't see that going away. And Americans will continue to grow and thrive because, hey, if we do something well, that is definitely what we do as Americans, right?
You mentioned a really big word, and that calls adapt. And I think we will adapt. And if we have a society that has freedom, people will move towards and go towards those things that they want to do, what they enjoy. And having children is enjoyable. Some of the most enjoyable times I have is with my children and grandchildren, the family. But if you start to press so hard that people make decisions not to have children, then you're taking away from the future enjoyment. And I think that going back to that comment, adapt. I think we're going to find ways in which to adapt. You're right. I mean, the laughter and the giggle of a child is priceless. There's things that you wish you could capture and put in a bottle somewhere and bring it out at a future date. But having family is so important. And a child should not be viewed as a burden. It's a responsibility, no question about that. But it should not be determined as a burden. Oh, if we have another child, it's going to cost this much. That should not be the reason not to have a child, right?
And the household responsibilities traditionally would fall on the mother.
Right.
In terms of food and kids. And, we're already seeing that shift. And I think we will see that even more so, that the household responsibilities of raising children will become more collaborative between the two parents, and or if there's grandparents available around or aunts and uncles, it will become a more collaborative experience. Literally, it takes a village, right? I think that's going to be one of the solutions we'll see in the future.
And I think there's organization. I mean, from a standpoint of solution, I think our solution is to how to create a better family unit and make it more feasible and economical to enjoy that experience in your life. To me, I wouldn't give that up for anything. But I don't want to get to the point of making a decision that's saying, oh, we can't have another child because it's going to cost X. But if there was support from the outside, not only from outside family, but also outside in job, tax, bureaucratic, that would support having more children, how beautiful would that be, right?
Yep. My favorite quote from the article, just to wrap us up here, was a line that said, "It's not just politicians who need more babies to kiss."
It was really a good one.
So very sweet, because it is hard. It is challenging. Just like you said, Jeremiah, there's beauty in the hardship because it's so rewarding and so rich.
That's right. Well, I think it's refreshing hearing from you as well, Randy. Like, it's not just your own kids, right? It's grandkids. And I think someone who's choosing to not have kids because it's going to cost, an extra $18,000 a year in their 20s and 30s, right? They may not realize they're giving up, not just that child as they raise them, but also being a grandparent for those future generations. Like, there's a lot that they're giving up, and to outweigh that cost, to say, well, even if it does cost X amount throughout the years, you still have to figure it out. However, the beauty and the joy and the adventure that can add to your life isn't just that child; it's grandchildren. It's much larger than that. So,
and I think the solutions have to be more encompassing. And we'll listen to politicians talk about, we'll give you the stipend so you'll have another child. I don't think that's going to work. I think they have to be more encompassing in a social, economic environment. How that works out, I don't know for sure. I've got some thoughts and ideas, but nobody's called me and asked me specifically for those. But family is critically important to the dynamic of our country.
Yep.
And the more that we are tied by family, the stronger our country is going to be. And I think that's really critically important.
Yeah, and let me just say, for any listener who's interested, Jeremiah and I are a dual income home. We have 4 children, and I have 0 regrets. Am I tired? Yes. But am I putting my whole self into it? Yes, and I do enjoy it. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening. And any final thoughts, gentlemen?
No, my final thought is kids are great. I love children. I love grandchildren. I love the sound and the laughter of a child.
And I think it's a beautiful thing of each generation of the reason we do what we do, the reason we plan for people, the reason we look at finances is because, man, there's such good out there. And there's a lot of choices that need to happen between here and there. So, if someone is a grandparent and they're, not sure how to help their kids and their grandkids, like, man, let's make a plan. Let's figure this out. Let's find something that fits for your family.
For sure.
Exactly. All right. Thanks for listening. We have a few more things to let you know about before we go. Podcast reviews really help us to serve more people and get this information into the hands of the people who need it. Please leave us a review. Even if it's not 5 stars, we welcome the feedback.
And we invite you to let us know what topics you would like to hear more about, or what would benefit the people in your life who you're closest to. We have more resources online. Those resources are designed to help you share this great information easily with people in your life. To access those resources, please visit tricordadvisors.com.
Often we hear from clients that they wish they had talked to us sooner. If that's you, we'd be thrilled to see how financial planning can benefit your life. Email us at contact@tricordadvisors.com or simply click on the link in the show notes.
This show was produced by Graham Gardner at Model FA. Find out more about how to create a podcast for your financial planning business by visiting modelfa.com. We love creating content that's useful, resourceful, and maybe even a little entertaining. We want to make this mega universe of financial topics and advice applicable and helpful to your life.
Remember, at Tricord Advisors, we are your future's best ally.